Hello, BookTube. It's time to read Chapter 2, the second essay in A. Edward Newton's The Amenities of Book Collecting and Kindred Affections, published 1920 by John Lane, The Bodley Head. But most of the essays were originally published in The Atlantic a few years before, during and after the First World War. The second chapter is entitled Book Collecting at Home. If you remember, we did Book Collecting Abroad for chapter 1. In the preceding chapter, I wrote of the amenities of book collecting in London, of my adventures in the shops of Bond Street and Piccadilly, of Holborn and the Strand, almost as though this paradise of the book collector were his only happy hunting ground. But all the good hunting is not found in London. New York has a number of attractive shops, Philadelphia at least two, while there are several in Chicago, and in unexpected places in the West. Where in all the world will you find so free a buyer, always ready to take a chance to turn a volume at a profit, as George D. Smith? He holds the record for having paid the highest price ever paid for a book at auction, $50,000 for a copy of the Gutenberg Bible, purchased for Mr. Henry E. Huntington at the wholesale. And not only did he pay the highest price, he also bought more than any other purchaser of the fine books disposed of at that sale. I have heard Smith's rivals complain that he is not a bookseller in the proper sense of the word, that he buys without discretion and without exact knowledge. Such criticism, I take it, is simply the natural result of jealousy. George D. Smith has sold more fine books than perhaps any two of his rivals. And he provides a picture of George D. Smith. There is no affection of dignity or of knowledge about him, and it is well that there is not. No one knows all there is to know about books. A man might know much more than he, such men there are, and yet lack the qualities which have enabled him to secure and retain the confidence and commissions of his patrons. He is practically the main support of the auction rooms in this country, and I have frequently seen him leave a sale in which he had purchased every important book that came up. He had knowledge and a confidence enough for that, and I cannot see why his frankness and lack of affection should be counted against him. It takes all kinds of men to make a world, and George is several kinds in himself. 25 years ago in London, early in my book collecting days, I came across a bundle of dusty volumes in an old bookshop in the Strand. The shop and that part of the Strand have long since disappeared, and bought the lot for, as I remember, 2 guineas. Subsequently, upon going through the contents carefully, I found that I acquired what appeared to be quite a valuable little parcel. There were the following: Tales from Shakespeare, Baldwin and Craddock, 5th edition, 1831. Lamb's Prose Works, 3 volumes, Moxham, 1836. The Letters of Charles Lamb, 2 volumes, Moxham, 1837, with the inscription to J.P. Collier, Esquire, from his friend H.C. Robinson. Telford's Final Memorials of Charles Lamb, 2 volumes, Moxham, 1848. By the way, the last was Wordsworth's copy with his signature on the title page of each volume, and I observed for the first time that the book was dedicated to him. Loosely inserted in several of the volumes were newspaper clippings, a number of pages of manuscript in John Payne Collier's handwriting, a part of a letter from Mary Lamb addressed to Jane Collier, his mother, and in several of the volumes were notes in Collier's handwriting referring to matters in the text, as were against a reference to Lamb's essay on roast pig. Collier says in pencil, "My mother sent the pig to Lamb." Again, where Telford, referring to an evening with Lamb, says, "We mounted to the top story and were soon seated behind the cheerful fire. Hot water and its better adjuncts were soon before us." Collier writes, "Both Lamb and Telford died of the better adjuncts." There was a large number of such pencil notes. The pages of manuscript in Collier's heavy and, as he calls it, infirm hand began. In relation to C. Lamb and Southey, Mr. Cousins possesses an interesting manuscript, as I know. It is bound as a small quarto, but the writing of Lamb, and chiefly by Southey, is post. 8VO. They seem to have been contributions to an annual anthology published by Cottle of Bristol. The manuscript begins with an advertisement in the handwriting of Southey, and it is followed immediately by a poem in Lamb's handwriting headed Elegy on a Quid of Tobacco in 10 stanzas, rhyming alternately thus: It lay before me on the close grazed grass, behind my path an old tobacco quid, and shall I by the mute adviser pass, without one serious thought, and heavens forbid. The next day, Collier copied more of the poems for on another sheet. He remarks, "As in my hand is steadier today, I have copied the remaining stanzas." And there's the tobacco one there. On another sheet, referring to Cousin's manuscript, Collier writes, "The whole consists of about 60 leaves, chiefly in the handwriting of Southey, and it contains productions by Lamb, one of the sort of jeu d'esprit called the Redican Barbers, on a hair-dressing of 12 young men of Christchurch College, and the other headed Dirge for him who shall deserve it. This has no signature, but the whole is in Lamb's clear young hand, and it shows very plainly that he partook not only of the poetical but of the political feeling of the time. The signatures are various: Erythro, Rialto, Walter, and so forth, and at the end are 4 love elegies in serious poem by Charles Lamb entitled Living Without God in the World. How many of these were printed elsewhere or in Cottle's anthology, I do not know. I would willingly copy more, did not my hand fail me. JBC." 20 years later, in New York, one day, George D. Smith asked me if I would care to buy an interesting volume of Southey manuscripts, and to my great surprise, handed me the identical little quarto, which Collier had many years before found so interesting that he had made excerpts from it. It might not have made much instant appeal to my recollection of my purchase in London had it not been for the inserted note, almost identical with the one in the loose slip in my Lamb volume, obviously in Collier's infirm hand, repeating briefly that he had said on the loose sheets in my volumes at home. Mr. Cousins, the former owner of the manuscripts, had added a note in 1798 or 1799. Charles Lamb contributed to the annual anthology which Mr. Cottle, a bookseller of Bristol, published jointly with Coleridge and Southey. The manuscript is partially in the handwriting of Southey and is formerly the property of Cottle of Bristol. Upon investigation, I ascertained that the little volume of manuscript verse had passed from Mr. Cousins' possession into that of Augustin Daly, at whose sale it had been catalogued as the Southey manuscript, with small reference to its Lamb interest. Although the price was high, the temptation to buy was too strong to be resisted. So, after many years, the small quarto of original poems by Lamb, Southey, and others, and Collier's description of it, stand side by side in my library. For me, the 3 poems by Lamb outweigh the interest and value of all others. The volume is labeled Southey Manuscript, a long time since the property of Mr. Cottle of Bristol. The most scholarly bookseller in the country today is Dr. Rosenbach. Rosie, as we who knew him will well called him. It was not his original intention to deal in rare books, but to become a professor of English, a calling for which few have a finer appreciation, but mere scholars abound. He must have felt that we collectors needed someone to guide our tastes and deplete our bank accounts. In both, he is unequaled. His spacious second-floor room in Walnut Street is filled with the rarest volumes. Ask, and it shall be given you, with a bill at the end of the month. It is a delightful place to spend a rainy morning, and you are certain to depart a wiser if a poorer man. I once spent some hours with the doctor in company with my friend Tinker, not the great Tinker who plays ball for the bank's president's wage, but the less famous Tinker, the professor of English at Yale. We had been looking at Shakespeare folios and quartos and Spencer's and Herrick's and Milton's priceless volumes of the 16th and 17th centuries. When looking out the window, Rosie remarked, "There goes John G. Johnson." "Oh," said my friend, "I thought you were going to say John Dryden. It would not have surprised me in the least." Don't expect ever to discover anything at Rosenbach's except how ignorant you are. Rosie does all the discovering himself, as when a few years ago he found a volume of old pamphlets, a copy of the first edition of Dr. Johnson's famous prologue spoken at the opening of the theater at Drury Lane. It will be remembered that the prologue contains several of the doctor's most famous lines, criticisms of the stage, and true to today when they are uttered, as where he says, "The drama's laws, the drama's patrons give, for we that live to please must please to live." It is also the line in which, speaking of Shakespeare, he says, "And panting time toiled after him in vain." Garrick having criticized this line, Johnson remarked, "Sir Garrick is a prosaical rogue. The next time I write, I will make both time and space pant." And there's a picture of Rosie Rosenbach. The discovery of Dr. Rosenbach of his prologue shows that the days of romance and book hunting are not over. It is not to be found in the British Museum. So far as we know, it is the only copy in existence. Rosie has declined to sell it, though tempting offers have been made, for he is a book lover as well as a bookseller. That he is a rare judge of human nature, too, is evidenced by a little card over his desk on which is printed the text, it is not, saith the buyer, but when he hath gone his way, then he boasteth." Proverbs 20:14. That is exactly what I did when I secured for him my Robinson Crusoe, the first edition of 2 volumes, and the third, which may not be Defoe's. It lacks one point, perhaps the word apply, apply. The last word on the page 1 of the preface is correctly spelled, not spelled apyly, as in some copies I have seen. The matter, I believe, is not clear. The type may have been correctly set at first and then became corrupted in process of printing, or a few copies may have been so printed before the error had been noted was corrected. After page 304 of volume 1, the paper is of thinner and poorer quality than on the pages preceding it. The 3 volumes are clean and binding contemporary calf, and folding maps immaculate, and the first 2 volumes were once the property of Mr. William Congreve. Altogether, it is a book of which the collector boasteth. For some unexplained reason, I have never been able to buy as many books from Walter Hill of Chicago as I should like. He is one of the most amiable and reliable men in the business. His catalogues issued from time to time are delightful. He once put me under an obligation which I have not yet repaid and which I want to record. Several years ago I met him in the streets of Philadelphia and said to him, "Hello, what are you doing here? Are you buying or selling?" "Both," he said. "I bought some nice books only a few minutes ago at Seltzer's." "Don't tell me," I cried. "The Oliver Twist, that presentation copy to Macready, was among them." "It was. Why, did you want it?" "Want it?" said I. "I have just been waiting for my bank account to recover from a capital operation to buy it." "All right, then," he said. "I'll turn it over at just what I paid for it, and you can send me your check when you are ready." I was mean enough to accept his offer, and the book today is worth at least twice what I paid. Yet, come to think of it, several nice volumes, collated and perfect, came from him. There is my Vicar, not the first edition, but the misprints on volume 2, page 159, page 165, page 95. Wakefield, Wackcfield, for Wakefield, Wakefield, that came from North, but the one with Rawlinson plates and Evelina embellished with engravings and wretchedly printed in vile paper, and says, "And she stoops to conquer," with all the errors just as they should be, a printer's carnival. I have no doubt there are many more. Sessler has some unexpectedly fine things from time to time. He goes abroad every year with his pocket full of money and comes back with a lot of things that quickly empty ours. Dickens is one of his specialties, and from what I have secured, at least 5 of the 21 presentation Dickenses that I boast of a few years ago, quite a number came on the market at prices which today seem very low. In my last book hunting experience in London, I saw only one presentation Dickens, but as the price was about 3 times what I had accustomed myself to pay Sessler, I let it pass. Sessler studies his customers' weaknesses. That's where his strength lies. When I came back from Europe some years ago, I discovered that he had bought for me, in my absence at the Lambert sale, one item which he knew I would not resist. It was a little pen and ink drawing of Thackeray, by Thackeray, the first sketch afterwards more fully elaborated, illustrating the Vanity Fair, where at the end of the first chapter, the immortal Becky, driving away from Miss Pinkerton's school, throws Dr. Johnson's dictionary out of the window in the carriage as it drives off. And there is the sketching. It's a bit faint. I think that all who know him will agree with me that Luther S. Livingston was much of a gentleman, too much of a scholar. Perhaps I should add, too much of an invalid to take high rank as a bookseller. His knowledge was profound. He was an appreciative bibliographer, witnessed the work he did on Lamb for Mr. J. A. Spoor of Chicago, but I always felt a trifle embarrassed when I asked him the price of anything he had to sell. One could ask him anything else, but to offer money to Livingston seemed rather like offering money to your host after an excellent dinner. He enjoyed the love and respect of all book collectors, and we all congratulated him when he graduated from the bookshop to the library. For many years in charge of the rare book department of Dodd, Mead and Company, and subsequently a partner of Robert Dodd, he was the first custodian of the choice collection of books formed by the late Harry Elkins Widener and bequeathed by the latter's mother to Harvard. A more admirable selection could not have been made. A scholar and a gentleman, he brought to that position just the qualities needed for a post of such distinction, but unhappily he lived hardly long enough to take possession of it. He died at Christmas 1914 after a long and painful illness. James F. Drake in New York specializes in association copies and in first editions of 19th century authors. His stock I have frequently laid under contribution. My Surtees and many other colored plate books come from him, and first editions innumerable of authors now being collected. I know of no bibliography of George Moore, but my set, I think, is complete. Many are presentation copies. George Moore's many admirers will remember that his volume, Memoirs of My Dead Life, is much sought in the first English edition. I have the proof sheets of the entire volume showing many corrections, as in the specimen on page 50. My literature at Nurse, a pamphlet attacking the censorship in the novel established by Moody, which was published in threepence, now commands $40, is ascribed to Willie Wilde, while Pagan Poems was a suitable gift to Oscar Wilde with the author's compliments. And here's the literature at Nurse. Memories of Dead Life. There it is there. And then there's the Oscar Wilde, owned by Oscar Wilde, Pagan Poems. There is no halt in the constantly advancing value of the first editions of Oscar Wilde. That interest in the man still continues, is evidenced by the steady stream of books about him. Ransom's Oscar Wilde immediately impressed Oscar Wilde three times tried, and the first stone privately printed by the unspeakable Scott, already difficult to procure, are among the latest. For books on the of the moment published in small editions, which almost immediately become scarce, Drake's shop at 40th Street is headquarters, and as my club in New York is nearby, I find myself frequently dropping in for a book and a bit of a gossip. There are drawbacks as well as compensations to living in the country. Gossip about book collecting has its charms, as William Loring Andrews has taught me. It is sometimes difficult to get it, living as I do 12 miles from a lemon. And so when I am in New York and have absorbed what I can of Drake's, who is very exact in his information he imparts, I usually call at Gabriel Wells. How Wells receives you with open arms and a good cigar is in his lofty rooms on the avenue overlooking the library is known to most collectors. Books and sets are perhaps, I should say, were his specialty. Recently he has gone in for very choice items, which, when offered, must be secured or anguishes one's portion thereafter. My last interview with him resulted in my separating myself from a bunch of Liberty bonds which I had intended as a solace for my old age. But a few words from Wells convinced me that Dr. Johnson was right when he said, "It is better to live rich than to die rich." And so I walked away with a copy of Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which is about as rare a book as one can hope to find at the end of a busy day. And there's, I'm assuming, the title page there. It was, if I remember correctly, Ernest Dressel North who first aroused my interest in Lamb bibliographically. I had learned to love him in a dumpy little green cloth volume, Elia and Elenia, published by Moxham, which I had picked up at Leary's, and which bears upon the title page the glaring inaccuracy, the only complete edition. I have this worthless little volume among my first editions. To me it is one, and it is certainly the last volume of Lamb I would part with. It must be all of 30 years ago that I went to London with a list of books by and about Charles Lamb, some 20 volumes in all, which North had prepared for me. I came across this list not long ago and was amused at the prices that he suggested I might safely pay. Guineas where his list gives shillings would not today separate the books from their owners. It was at this time, too, that I made my first Lamb pilgrimage, going to every place of interest I could find, from Christ's Hospital to the Newgate Street, where I saw the Blue Coat Boys at dinner, to the neglected grave at Edmund Churchyard, where Charles and Mary Lamb lie buried side by side. The illustration facing page 54 is made from a negative I procured in 1890 of the house at Enfield in which Lamb lived from October 1829 to May 1833. And there's the house there. A good story is told of my friend Edmund D. Brooks, the bookseller of far-off Minneapolis. Brooks, who knows his way about London and is much at home with the talent as any other men, set out one day to make a quick turn, in stock market parlance. Armed with a large sum of money, the sinews of book buying as well as of war, he casually dropped in on Walter Spencer, who was offering for sale a manuscript of Dickens's Cricket. The price was known to be pretty steep, but Brooks was prepared to pay it. What he did not know was that in the upper room over Spencer's shop, another bookseller was also, with a large sum in pocket, was debating the price of the very item, raising his offer by slow degrees. But it did not take Brooks long to discover that negotiations were progressing and that quick action was necessary. Calling Spencer aside, he inquired the price, paid the money, and took the invaluable manuscript away in the taxi. The whole transaction had occupied only a couple of minutes. Spencer then returned to his first customer, who continued the attack until, to close the argument, Spencer quietly remarked that the manuscript had been sold, paid for, and had passed out of his possession. It reminds one of the story of the late A.J. Cassett, the mastermind of the railroad presidents of the time, bought the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railway right under the nose of President Garrett of the Baltimore and Ohio. There were loud cries of anguish from the defeated parties on both occasions, but the book-selling story is not over yet. For a few hours later, Sabin, the bookseller deluxe, had the Dickens manuscript displayed in his shop window in Bond Street, and Brooks had a sheaf of Chris Bank of England notes in his pocket in which to advance negotiations in other directions. I take little or no interest in bindings. I want the book as originally published on boards, uncut, in old sheep or in cloth, and as clean and as fair as may be. I am not without sense of color, and the backs of books bound in various colored leathers, suitably gilt, placed with some eye for arrangement on the shelves, are to me as beautiful and suggestive in any picture yet. As one cannot have everything, I yield the beauty and fragrance of leather for the fascination of the original state as issued. Nor am I unmindful how invariably in binding a book is trimming, be it ever so little, and gilding its edges, one lops off no small part of its value. This fact should be pointed out to all young collectors. They should learn to let their books alone, and if they must patronize a binder, have slip cases or pulled cases made. They serve every purpose. The book will be protected if it is falling apart and unpresentable, and one's craving for the color and gilt will be satisfied, as Eckel says in his bibliography of Dickens. The tendency of the modern collector has steadily moved towards books in the original state, books as they were when they were created, and it is doubtful if there will be much deviation from this taste in the future. Only the very immature book buyer will deprive himself of the pleasure of collecting and buy a complete set of some author he much esteems in first editions, assembled and bound without care or thought other than to produce a piece of merchandise and sell it sell it for as much as it will fetch. The rich and ignorant buyer should be made to confine his attention to the purchases of subscription books. These are produced in quantity especially for his benefit, and it should leave our books alone. The present combination of many rich men and relatively few fine books is slowly working my ruin. I know it is. We live in a lawful age, an age in which it seems to every one's idea to pass laws. I would have a law for the protection of old books, and our legislators in Washington might do much worse than consider the suggestion. On another form of book, the collector could be warned against the extra illustrated volume. The extra illustrations of a favorite author is a tedious and expensive method of wasting money and mutilating other books the while. I confess to having a few, but I have bought them at a very small part of what they cost to produce, and I do not encourage their production. I know something of the art of inlaying prints. I had a distinguished and venerable teacher, the late Ferdinand J. Drewer, of Philadelphia, who formed a priceless collection of autographs, which at his death he bequeathed to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Mr. Drewer was a collector of the old school. He was a friend of John Allen, one of the earliest book collectors in the country, of whom a memorial was published by the Bradford Club in 1864. Mr. Drewer spent the leisure of his years and a small fortune in inlaying plates and pages of text on such books as he fancied. I remember well, as a lad, being allowed to pore over his sumptuous extra illustrated books, filled with autographed letters, portraits, and views of hours at a time. Little did I think that these volumes, the object of such loving care, would be sold at auction. And I'll just pause there. He doesn't name Grangerizing, but that's what it is. It's Grangerizing, where you rip apart other books or add in the book itself and rebind it with a lot more. It could be anything, letters, other illustrations, and so forth. Excuse me. Many years after his death, the family decided to dispose a portion of his library. Stan Henkels conducted the sale. When the well-known volumes came up, I was all in a tremble. I seemed hardly possible that any of the famous Dreer books were to come within my grasp. But alas, fashions changed, and I have said before, a history of the Bank of North America, excuse me, our oldest national bank, which enjoys the unique distinction of not calling itself a national bank, went not to an officer or director of that sound old Philadelphia institution, but to George D. Smith of New York for a song, in a high key, but a song nevertheless. An oration in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia brought close to $1,000, but in addition to the rare portraits and views, there were 57 autographed letters in it. Sold separately, they would have brought several times as much. Smith was the buyer, and there came a history of Christ Church, full of the most interesting material, as Old Christ Church is the most beautiful and interesting colonial church in America. There was the rector. Where was the rector? Where were the wardens and the vestry thereof? No sign of them. Smith was the buyer. The books were going, and for almost nothing in every case, to Smith. At last came the memoirs of Nicholas Biddle of the famous old Bank of the United States. Hear ye, Biddles, if any Biddles there be. There are in plenty, but not here. Smith, having bought all the rest, stopped when he saw me bidding. The hammer fell, and I was the owner of the most interesting volume in the whole Dreer collection, a volume I had so often coveted as a boy, with the letters and portraits of Penn, Franklin, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Marshall, and so forth. In all, 28 of them, and mine for $10 apiece. Portraits and binding thrown in. It is painful to witness the slaughter of another possessions. It makes one wonder, but that is not what we collect books for. In the last analysis, pretty much everything, including poetry, is merchandise, and every important book sooner or later turns up in the auction house. The dozen or 50 men present represented the book buyers of the world. You are buying against them. When you sell a book at auction, the whole world is your market. This refers, of course, to an important sales. The other times books are frequently disposed of at much less than their real value. These sales it pays the book collector to attend personally if he can, or better still, to entrust his bid to the auctioneer or some representative in whom he has confidence. Most profitably of all for the buyer are the sales where furniture, pictures, and rugs are disposed of, with, finally, a few books knocked down by one who knows nothing of their value. Many are the volumes in my library which have been picked up on such occasions for the very few dollars for which they are worth infinitely more than I paid for them. I have in mind my copy of the first edition of Boswell's Corsica in fine old cloth, with the inscription to the Right Honourable the Earl Marischal of Scotland, as a mark of sincere regard and affection from the author, James Boswell. This stands me only a few dollars in London. I should have been asked, and would have paid £20 for it. Some men haunt the auction rooms all the time. I do not. I have a living to make, and I am not quick in making it. Moreover, the spirit of competition invariably leads me astray, and I never come away without finding myself the owner of at least one book, usually a large one, which should properly be entitled, "What Will He Do With It?" No book collector should be without a book plate, and a book plate, once inserted in a volume, should never be removed. When the plate is that of a good collector, it constitutes an endorsement and adds a certain interest and value to the volume. I was once going through the collection of a friend and observing the absence of book plate. I asked why it was. He replied, "The selection of a book plate is such a serious matter." It is, and I should never have been able to get one suited me entirely, had not my good friend Osgood of Princeton come to my rescue. He was working in my library some years ago on an exquisite appreciation of Johnson. When noticing on my writing table a pen and ink sketch, he asked, "What's this?" I replied with a sigh that it was a suggestion for a book plate which I had received from London. I had described in a letter exactly what I wanted, an association plate strictly in the 18th century style. Fleet Street was to be indicated with Temple Bar in the background. It was to be plain and dignified in treatment. What came was indeed a sketch of Fleet Street and very much more. There were scrolls and flourishes, eggs and darts and fleur-de-lis, a little of everything in the word. It was impossible. "Let me see what I can do," said Osgood. When I returned home that evening, there was waiting for me an exquisite pencil sketch, every detail faultless. Fleet Street, with its tavern signs in the background, Temple Bar, with Johnson and Goldsmith, the latter pointing to it and remarking shyly, Forcitian et nomen nostrum misabertur isitis." I was delightful, as I had reason to believe. In due course, after discussions as to the selection of a suitable model, we finally agreed on the line out of Boswell, "Sir, the bibliographical part of literature is what I love most," and the sketch went off to Sidney Smith of Boston, the distinguished book engraver. And there is a photo of his, oh, it's hard to say, of his bookplate. I have a fondness for college professors. I must have inherited it from a rich old uncle from whom I unluckily inherited nothing else, who had a similar weakness for preachers. Let a man, however stupid, once get a license to wear his collar backwards, and the door was flung open and the table spread. I have often thought that an ecstasy of delight he would have uh, been thrown into had he met a churchman whose rank uh, permitted him to wear his entire ecclesiastical panoply backwards. My weakness for the scholars is just such a whimsy. As a rule, they are not so indulgent to collectors as they should be. They write books, and we buy and read them when we can. My lifelong friend Felix Schelling, in England he would be Sir Felix, is more lenient than most. My copy of his Elizabethan dramas, which was made him famous among students, is uncut and, I am afraid, to some extent unopened. Frankly, it is too scholarly to read with enjoyment. Indeed, I sometimes think that it was my protest that led him to adopt the easier and smoother style apparent in his later books. English literature during the lifetime of Shakespeare and the English lyric, be this as it may, he has shown that he can use the scholarly and the familiar style in equal facility, and when he chooses, he can turn a compliment like one of his own 16th century courtiers. I had always doubted the famous book index story, Mill, J.S., on Liberty, ditto, on the floss, until one day my friend Tinker sent me a dedication copy of his Dr. Johnson and Fanny Burney, in which I read and knew that he was poking fun at me for my bookish weakness. This copy is a genuine specimen of the first edition, uncut and unopened, signed and certified by the editor. And that note was signed by his friend Chauncey Brewster Tinker. No copy is now known to exist of the suppressed first state of this first edition, and in which, instead of the present entry in the index under Pope, Alexander, page 111, occurred the words Pope Alexander 111. How much more valuable this copy would have been if this blunder point, and the judicious would call it, had not been corrected until the second edition. The work of my office was interrupted one summer morning several years ago by a receipt of a cable from London, apparently in code, which I was advised would not translate. Upon its being submitted to me, I found that it did not require translating, but it was not surprised that it was somewhat bewildering to others. It read, Johnson, Piazza Dictionary, £40, Hut. To me, it was perfectly clear that Mrs. Thrale Piozzi's copy of Dr. Johnson's dictionary, 2 volumes folio, was to be had for my friend Hutt for £40. I dispatched the money and in due course received the volumes. Inserted in one of them was a long holograph letter to the thralls, giving them some excellent advice on the management of their affairs. I think it very probably in your power. I think it very probably in your power to lay up £8,000 a year for every year to come, interesting all the time, and needs not be increased. The splendor of the external appearance, and surely such a state is not to be put in yearly hazard for the pleasure of keeping the house full, or the ambition of outbrewing whitebreads. Stop now, and you are safe. Stop a few years, and you may go safely on thereafter, if to go on shall be worth the while. Johnson's letters, like his talks, are compact with wisdom, and many of them are as easy as the proverbial old shoe. Fancy Sam Johnson, the great lexicographer, writing to Mrs. Thrall and telling her to come home and take care of him, as he says to, "Come on, come with a whoop, come with a call, come with goodwill, or come not at all." I own 30 or 40 Johnson letters, including the one in which he describes what he called his menagerie, dependents too old, too poor, or too peevish to find asylum elsewhere. He writes, "We have a tolerable concord at home, but no love. Williams hates everybody. Lovett hates de Mousselines, and does not leave Williams. Desmoulins hates them both. Pole loves none of them." But I must be careful. I had firmly resolved not to say anything which would lead anyone to suspect that I am Johnson mad. But I admit that such is the case. I am never without a copy of Boswell. What edition? Any edition. I have them all. The first in boards uncut for my personal satisfaction, an extra illustrated copy of the same for display, Birbeck Hills for reference, and the cheap old bond copy which 30 years ago I first read because I knew it by heart. Yes, I can truly say that with Leslie Stephen, my enjoyment of books began and ended with Boswell's Life of Johnson. So there ends Chapter 2. And Chapter 3 is Old Catalogs and New Prices. And this one is a bit long. Yeah, it's a long one. It'll be good 40 pages, so it'll be about 10 pages longer, so it'll take probably 55 minutes, maybe an hour. Depends how it goes. But anyway, I'll leave it there, BookTube, and thank you if you've made it this far. I hope you're enjoying it. Do leave any comments or any questions regarding what I've read, because sometimes not everything is the clearest. I do understand, because he's referring to other books or booksellers and so forth that might be a little obscure at times. So do let me know in the comments, and I will see you next time. Thank you, BookTube.